Okay.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining us to hear about our discussion around the Unizin Data Book. We're really excited about this project. It's new. It's something that's gone a lot of cycles between the data services and solutions team. And yeah, I'm excited to chat about it. So my name is James Russell. I'm the Senior Director of Research Support and Assurance, and I'm joined by my wonderful colleagues, Kyle and Sarah. Kyle?
Sure, just really quickly, I'm Kyle Unruh. I'm the data solutions architect at Unizin. I've been at Unizin for about 2 years and excited to see you all. Haven't quite made it to a live summit yet. I joined in 2020, but maybe next year we'll be in person, hopefully. Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sara Bolf. I'm the data analyst at Unizin. I've been here almost a year, and I'm really excited to be here at my first summit. It's great to meet everyone.
Super, thank you both. So our interest in a Unizin Data Book centers around primarily 2 themes. We're interested in one, finding better ways to talk to a variety of audiences about what is possible through the Unizin Data Platform, the UDP, and we'll reference that throughout. And 2, how to underscore the value of looking at data cross-institutionally through the lens of the consortium, not just through individual member institutions. So our efforts to date are exploratory. To realize the data book will take considerable member input and guidance, we realize. So we're kind of in the nascency of investigating and really exploring these ideas. So while Unizin has developed 5 foundational dashboards for each member institution that speak to common themes and interests, student time spent in the LMS or student content views, and Kyle will discuss a bit about that later today. Creating anonymized versions of those dashboards for public consumption has challenges and doesn't necessarily speak to the potential of cross-institutional research. Our concept of the Unizin Data Book, we think, can speak to multiple themes and audience as well, underscore the unique representation of the UDP cross-institutionally, and in the process of our kind of imagining what is possible through the data book, has surfaced additional areas of interest that we think have real merit. So our discussion today will cover these various components and dive into what a Unizin data book could look like. So first, a data book in our heads is patterned off of something like the County City Data Book that looks at key indicators across the US at the level of counties and cities. The County and City Data Book pulls from multiple data sources, similar in a way to the UDP in terms of harmonizing different learning tools, and harmonizes them across a uniform geographic distribution, so counties and cities. And so it aggregates a specific geographic level, and it represents key features of interest. So what do we want to do at the consortium level? Well, we want to take rich learner and learning environment data and look at data representations at the level of the consortium as a whole. And to do this, we can draw on the entirety of the UDP across institutions and over time. So we're looking at approximately 3.1 million students, 5.9 million courses, and 26 billion events. This view gives us learner behaviors across 13 R1 institutions that will allow us to represent a view, not the definitive view or the only view, into the state of higher education, for example, for a specific year or time. So at a high level, we want to represent the Unizin Data Book as a kind of curated representation of learner and learning environment data aggregated at the level of the consortium. And it would include or address the following: applicable to multiple audiences. We want it to be as much a catalyst for researchers as it is a compelling example of what is possible for prospective members. We want it to be richly visual. Using Kati Berner's Atlas of Knowledge as an example here, we want the Unizin Data Book to be visually engaging and tell compelling stories about how students learn and under what conditions learning happens. We want to bring in consortium level insights that lead to deeper investigations, surfacing what technologies, mobile or desktop, for example, students use to access their courses in the LMS, and the mode's potential influence on their coursework really opens the door for deeper investigation at the institutional level. We think thought leadership behind what is possible with modeled learner and learning environment data is important, presented through the data book and the UDP. And we see multiple formats, static and interactive formats, as a PDF in addition to a web interface that would allow a modicum of filtering and manipulation. So a side-by-side view of the county and city data book and the Unizin data book might look something like this. Census and other government organization data on the left, and proposed themes or features from the Unizin data book on the right. And the idea here is to surface features and metrics that are potentially compelling at the level of the consortium and instrumental to members and others as catalysts for further investigation. In addition, by surfacing UDP data this way, again at the consortium level, we see a unique capacity to see trends at scale. So understanding trends in course enrollment, such as the top 10 most popular courses across the consortium, when do changes in majors across the consortium most often occur? Look at submission behavior, early, late, or just in time, say in STEM versus non-STEM courses, demographic considerations by any number of areas, first generation students and their degree paths, most popular file types used within courses, departments, and programs, how are discussions used across the consortium, and longitudinal data marked changes in any of the above areas across and over time. So really, there are numerous ways data can be represented that are both revealing of teaching and learning within the consortium and as a vehicle for deeper investigation. And that, we want this resource to be catalytic in both of those ways. So who is our audience and why is the data book important to them? Well, first of all, our Unizin members. I think it can convey tangible value of the UDP, allows members to see the application and impact of their data in very clear and straightforward ways. And that leads potentially to a starting point for academic and institutional researchers who may be new to the UDP and who would benefit from representations of how the UCDM, the Unizin Common Data Model, which is the means by which the UDP is normalized and modeled and interrelated, is put into practice. And a catalyst for deeper analytics, as we've mentioned before. The metrics surfaced through the data book might serve to spark deeper, more focused analytics at the institutional level. In terms of higher education community in general, potential key indicators of the state of higher education, as I mentioned, seeing the data book as a unique UDP-driven reflection of the state of higher education among a group of R1 institutions. And then thought leadership behind the modeling and behind modeling and learning analytics, including in the data book, how our methods, data modeling, and features are selected and used. And then finally, prospective members convey what is possible, to have a tool not encumbered by confidentiality concerns that both represents what is possible at the institutional and cross-institutional levels. Most importantly, all of this hinges on governance and data considerations. At the top, we have data sharing agreements in our cross-institutional research workflow or process. The DSA, or data sharing agreement, acknowledges an institution's willingness to share their institutional data, and the cross-institutional research process operationalizes that agreement in giving institutions the opportunity to vet and review the data and methods involved. Both would be instrumental to our gaining cross-institutional buy-in from all member institutions or member institutions that are willing to participate. As important is defining and working with a committee comprised of member academic and institutional researchers. We want member institution researchers to drive our investigation into what are the most compelling features to select. And importantly, we want institutional input and guidance on how we employ the very important elements of race, ethnicity, and gender in particular. As always, we're concerned with transparency and ethical grounding or considerations of the data that we serve and the analytics that we create. We want to facilitate the use of the UDP through the data book to make understanding what can be achieved through the UDP clear as possible and to lead to actionable insights towards student success. We want to, of course, aggregate and anonymize the data. So that would be all course information in terms of granular course information, student information, instructor, and even institutional information, for the most part, aggregated and anonymized at the consortium level. We want to be careful about our awareness of proportions and percentages, especially in students in terms of enrollments. And we want to avoid institutional benchmarking. We don't want to use the data book to compare institutions. We may reference an institution A, B, or C. That would be a governance question that we would put to the committee, but it is important for us really to focus on the consortium as a whole. And then anonymize tools, not single out any one vendor or particular tool, but to categorically organize them according to video, grading tools, collaborative, and so forth. And then finally, to examine and consider contextualizing national trends, to put in context the UDP and the data that we surfaced with national trends and other data sources. So with that, I'm going to turn to Kyle, who will discuss in a bit more detail some of the proposed Unizin Data Book features. And I'm going to stop sharing now so he can take control of the presentation.
Sounds good. Thank you, James. Let me share my screen really quick. Can you guys see? It should be a slide that just says Unizin Data Book features. Good to go?
Great.
Okay, so James covered a lot of the high-level motivation and a lot of the considerations that we're taking to bring this data book together. And kind of where I want to supplement and support a lot of what he just showed by looking at it from some of the technical aspects of what we currently have from our last couple of years of working on data solutions and services on UDP instances, and kind of what our basis and framework has been to kind of get this data book started, and also kind of show a timeline for how this might progress and what this might actually look like in terms of data and in terms of delivery. So we'll start here, and this is just a selection of our universities. I have not picked my favorite or least favorite, just a selection from the website. And these are our member institutions, and each of these member institutions has a Unizin Data Platform instance. And each of these instances has had a combination of university resources and also our services team, Tracy and Lynette, hands-on time creating this unified Unizin Data Platform, which is a single standards-based representation of learners, learning environments, and learning processes, and which we really support and we believe has a lot of potential for characterizing the experience of learning. And each of these institutions has its own Unizin Data Platform with very firm boundaries. We do not share data across these boundaries unless, as James mentioned, the data sharing agreement is in place. And historically, that agreement has been exercised along very specific lines. So we'll have some sort of cross-institutional research that is supported by a grant, or there's some very specific time-bound engagement where the data needs to flow across these two institutions. And without getting into the details necessarily of where that lives, we spin up a separate environment, and we only bring in the necessary fields into that environment in the cloud to bring that data together. So this is, for the Unizin Data Book, a similar type of process we're going through, but with a few unique considerations. So what we have here is we have all of these individual UDP instances, and for our sake of the presentation today, let's just assume that all of these institutions have agreed to be part of the data book, and we're going through these governance, privacy, and approvals chain. that James mentioned before, to ensure that we're not benchmarking institutions, that we're not benchmarking tools, but that we are gathering data in a way to say at a consortium level, or perhaps even extrapolating to a more national level, what is the student experience across some of these demographic lines, or across some other ways we can characterize students. And this last piece here is I think important. Guidance is a big piece here. Where I see the core competency of Unizin in this process is in this data management, data aggregation scene in the cloud, where we can create a safe cloud-based environment for these data to live. But one of the kind of the spin-off deliverables and kind of action items from this kickoff presentation is we really want an engaged community of institutional researchers and academic researchers to help guide us as we bring this data together. So it's one piece to have the governance, privacy, de-identification and such, but it's also important for us to be in lockstep with domain experts such as yourselves that are defining and doing research in this space, so that we keep our finger on the pulse and make sure that the data that we aggregate is actually useful and significant for what we're trying to show about the learning experience. So once we have this going, and the guidance piece is something that's more revolving, some of these approvals are kind of one-off. Once we have the guidance piece in place, then we're going to craft something that I'm calling the Common Consortium UDP, which sounds like a big scary product, but I don't even know what it's actually going to look like necessarily, which is why I have air quotes around it. But essentially, this is going to be an internal facing instance in the cloud where all of this data lives, where to start off in terms of access to the data that's brought in, it will only be me, James, and Sarah. And any insights that are gained from this will be exported in an aggregated, de-identified way. So at this point, everything is starting from the university UDP systems, going through this governance and guidance framework into something that's internal and cloud-based, where Sarah, James, and I can write the queries to aggregate, and then in a feedback loop, go back to our guidance team and say, here are some insights that we're gaining, and then kind of go through that process as we build the data book. But the main point I want to emphasize in this slide is that we're keeping as much internal as possible because we're wanting to err on the side of caution, specifically because we haven't done cross-institutional research or a cross-institutional project on this scale before. We want to move with grace and care, especially when we're bringing in very identifiable fields such as student demographics or socioeconomic statuses of students. So that's kind of from a high level, how we would bring this data together and what the considerations are. I do want to kind of start now at a low level for anyone who's not familiar with the UDP, build up what the UDP is at a base level in terms of the data that we gather, and then some of the procedure and experience we've had building MARTs over the last year that have fueled and kickstarted some of the insights that we want to gain through the data book. So if you've been in other meetings with me in the past, you've probably seen this slide. So I apologize if this is a repeat, but for anyone new to the Unizin Data Platform, it's a standards-based, cloud-based data platform that coalesces and unifies student learning data from multiple learning systems. Ideally, wherever learning happens, we would love to commonly model that data inside the UDP. And what that looks like in practice are two data stores. One is called the context data store, and one is called the behavior data store. I may also use the term event store, but I mean the behavior store. And these are both governed by two different data standards, and these are kind of two different flavors of data. On the context data side, we're really focused on rich descriptions. So there's a lot of metadata about courses. There's a lot of metadata about enrollments. All of the socioeconomic and demographic data of students lives inside of the context store. It's a relational database. So if you're familiar with like primary and foreign keys and a lot of tables, that's how this data looks. And it's very suitable for batch processing. So commonly we get data that gets fed to us overnight. And then we update the data kind of once per day. So that's kind of the cadence of refresh. And the data standard that fuels this is the Unizin Common Data Model, which is based off of national data standards, but is kind of Unizin's managed standard. And all of the data that we receive on the context side is transformed according to this model. And the storage of this is a PostgreSQL database that you can access via Google Cloud. On the other side is the behavior data, which is a lot thinner in description, but is also a lot faster flowing. So this is stored in Google BigQuery, and the data standard that we use for this is the IMS Global Caliper standard. And the way that I think about this is it's very event driven. So these are clicks that students are making within the LMS. These are, there's an event that fires when a student finishes a quiz. There's an event that fires when a student accesses a file or clicks on a page. There's an event that fires when a student replies to a discussion thread. And the Caliper standard describes all these events as they happen. So this is not batch, this is more streaming, right? And the analytics that Sarah, James, and I do are really focused on kind of combining this batch context data of rich description with this kind of fast moving exhaustive list of behavior data to really try to characterize the learner and the environment in which they're learning. So that's kind of at a nutshell, the UDP and the scope of what the UDP captures. Within the last year, we've noticed that as we've engaged with stakeholders across the consortium, that there are some common needs, right? The UDP is great because it's standards-based, meaning that institution A's UDP has the same schema as institution B's, even though the data is different. And it's definitely not trivial to get the data to look the same necessarily, right? But because it's standards-based, there's an opportunity for us to, in a sense, write some code once to gain common insights. And so that's what we've been doing in the last year, that Sarah and I have been defining some what we call foundational data marts that are perhaps operational in scope a lot of the time. But these are some things that we've noticed are kind of heavy hitting needs across all institutions that the UDP can answer. And these are use cases that can have a single unified expression. Granted, the data is still open that if you want to change the logic, you can, but it's something that Sarah and I have been able to define and distribute in a scalable way across these use cases. And the 5 are like the course readiness dashboard, the idea being it's the start of the term. What are the status of the course shells, and are students actually able to access the content as they need to? And what is the publishing behavior of these courses? And each of these are fueled by a single mart that we've developed. So combination of the context data and behavior data produces a mart, and then a dashboard corresponds to the mart. So we have the course status mart that fuels this dashboard. We have a last activity dashboard. So along the very deep iceberg of engagement, one little tip of it could be the last time that a student has engaged with any sort of content in a course. We can track that and produce the last activity at a person and course level. There's a tool launch dashboard to see the tools that are provisioned in courses. Do they match what we would expect from a usage? So again, we can look at per person per course and see the LTI tool mart as a result. Content usage dashboard. So files that are uploaded into Canvas that are corresponding to modules or to learner activities. What are the kind of click-through rates on those files? And is there a way that we can present that alongside student behavior to get at some maybe design questions or instruction or content questions in that way? And then we have the Canvas tool use dashboard, which is very similar to the LTI tool dashboard, except we're looking just at kind of navigation behaviors through Canvas. So it's probably not surprising if we're looking at this across Canvas tools. The homepage is a hotspot, but then calendars are also a hotspot, and so are assignments, and so are quizzes and discussions. So we kind of use this dashboard to kind of see how students move through a course. And if we're looking at like an instructional design audience, this might be of interest. To kind of give an example, we have an anonymized version of our course readiness dashboard. And one of the things that it signals to me that it definitely is anonymized is it's my favorite line here. It's this kind of fourth from the bottom, the history of history course. is kind of interesting. I don't know if I would take that, but we got approval to anonymize this data. And this is a kind of a semi-public facing dashboard. We use this for demo purposes such as this. And this is the view on the left is the dashboard that they see, right? This is very institution specific. And it gives high level information about courses that are published or not published, some of the statuses that go with that, and publish times. And this is kind of a foundation for our Unizin Data Book. Not so much that we would just aggregate all of this data into the data book and say, here you go, here's your giant course published dashboard. But there are some nuggets here that might be interesting when we look at student behavior or experience. For instance, we're able to look at published times, and we're also able to look at course subjects and course numbers. What might it look like to look at the published time or design characteristics? These are the design characteristics of courses for STEM versus non-STEM courses. And is there a way that we can then correlate that with perhaps the number of students that are enrolled in the class or other metrics of student experience? So seeing these dashboards distributed to our 12 or 13 member institutions got us thinking about what might be interesting from these marks that we can derive and pull from existing work that might help us create an initial version of this Unizin Data Book. And so some of the analytics and scope are some themes that either it's through literature that we've read or just organic conversations that Sarah, James, and I have monthly with some of our members. You know, the movement and migration of STEM and non-STEM majors based on academic performance and proportion per academic level could be interesting to look at a consortium level based on some of these marks that we've developed. Breaking down some of this by grade, especially with the academic major migrations, might also be interesting. And also looking at this, going kind of heavily on the behavior data that we have in the UDP, looking at the devices that students are using to access their content. And are there any takeaways that we can have about those submission behaviors? Is there a correlation with perhaps a cohort of students that are using a certain device pattern? Does that correlate with them being more or less likely to submit assignments on time? That could be something that is an interesting study at a consortium level in an anonymized way. So these are some of the focus areas and kind of how we got to even thinking about the data book. At this point, I will hand it off to Sarah, and she'll show you some example visualizations to illustrate how we would maybe further pull this together.
Okay, I'll share my screen now. Okay. So as Kyle said, we now want to show you some examples of possible visuals that we might be able to include in the Unizin Data Book. All of the following visuals were produced from an anonymized sample of UDP data for illustrative purposes. So the first set of visuals focused on students' academic majors, specifically whether they were STEM or non-STEM majors. The first plot on this slide looks at the relationship between a student's major and their academic performance. This plot compares the average cumulative GPA for STEM majors and non-STEM majors. The average GPA for STEM majors is 3.34, and the average GPA for non-STEM majors is 3.19. Solely based on this plot, STEM majors seem to perform better academically on average than non-STEM majors do. For the Unizin Data Book, we would want to validate this type of finding. In general, we plan on performing statistical analysis and statistical tests on our findings in order to make sure that they're statistically significant. The second plot on this slide looks at the relationship between a student's academic level and their academic major. This plot shows the proportion of non-STEM majors to STEM majors for each academic level. As the academic level increases, the proportion of non-STEM majors also slightly increases, with second-year students having the lowest proportion of non-STEM majors and third-year students having the highest proportion. We can't conclude that there's a correlation between academic level and academic major from this plot. For example, it's possible that this relationship, this increase in non-STEM majors isn't actually due to the student's academic level, but to another external factor. And we would have to do further analysis to see if that's the case or not. With the second set of visuals, we wanted to look at, we want to learn more about the patterns of student major migrations. So the first plot focuses on the question of what fields are students changing their major to. Specifically, this plot compares the number of major changes for non-STEM to STEM fields versus the number of major changes from STEM to non-STEM fields. As you can see from the plot, there are many more major changes from non-STEM to STEM fields than for the reverse direction, meaning that more students are switching their major to a STEM field than to a non-STEM field. We also wanted to look into the question of why students are changing their major. So that's the second plot deals with that question. Specifically, one reason we thought students might change their major is because of their academic performance. Generally, one would think that students with higher grades would be less likely to change their major, where students with lower grades would be more likely to. However, this chart actually tells a different story. This chart shows that the majority of students who change their major are B students, making up around 56% of all total major changes. The second and third most prominent groups are A and C students, making up around 25% and 16% respectively. Comparatively, D and F students do not change their major as much. So overall, this chart shows a different relationship than one we expected with regards to academic performance and a student's decision to change their major. The final set of visuals we created focused on the relationship between a student's behaviors and their demographic group. For the purposes of this presentation, we de-identified the demographic groups, referring to them as demographic groups A through E instead. The first plot shows the breakdown of device usage by demographic group. All of the demographic groups primarily use desktop devices to access their course, with demographic group D having the largest proportion of desktop users. On the other hand, demographic groups B and C have the lowest proportion of desktop users and the highest proportion of mobile device users. A question that may arise from this plot is why these two groups have higher proportion of mobile device users than the other groups. Another question that might arise is whether the device used by a student affects their performance and behavior in their course. This second question relates to the second plot on the page, which looks at submission behaviors for different demographic groups. More specifically, it shows the average number of missing assignments versus the average number of late assignments for each demographic group. The rightmost point on the plot belongs to demographic group C, which has an average of 0.04 missing assignments and 0.26 late assignments per student. The leftmost point on the plot belongs to demographic group D, which has an average of 0.01 missing assignments and 0.12 late assignments per student. Overall, there seems to be a relationship between a student's demographic group and their submission behaviors. And looking at these two plots together, there also seems to be a relationship between a student's device usage and their submission behaviors. Specifically, there seems to be a relationship between a student's mobile device usage and having higher missing or late assignments. So we would want to look into whether a student's mobile device usage does actually relate to more missing or late assignments, as these plots imply. For our final presentation of the data book, we are planning on having two deliverables. The first will be a static PDF report available for public consumption. And the second will be interactive dashboards and de-identified data sets available for the Unizin consortium. That's the end of our presentation. So we'll now open it up for any questions. I'll stop screen sharing.
And we've already had some really good ones in the chat, and I think Kyle and I have been answering them. So thank you for those. And yes, happy to take any additional questions or comments.
Yeah, there was one question from Allison that was really interesting. I think it is one thing that we should emphasize is about how do we group these courses? Like, how do we classify alike courses? And this is something that we're definitely going to lean on some of our university stakeholders and experts as we make these connections and relationships. I think it's critical. Allison's question, for example, we could do like on a Canvas in design standpoint, forum heavy courses, assessment focused courses, content courses, very rarely used courses, right? That's one pivot we could do. And in fact, we want to do other pivots with like students as well. And this is definitely something that we want to get consistent across our institutions. And in fact, kind of on a more concrete scale, Sarah's been doing a lot of work with linking up our individual courses that might have related but different prefixes for the subject and linking them with zip codes, which are maintained standard ways of representing courses, which also helps with our de-identification, right? A course that's, Math 1300, that is University of Iowa Calculus 1 is the name, would then have a more standardized zip code representation of that. So that is definitely something we want to get right, is the grouping and the representation of those groups.
Yeah, I think I see another question that just came in. If I missed, apologies if I missed it, but would the data book be available for free to non-Unizin people? I think what we're envisioning is a forward-facing static text piece at first, and then keep the more dynamic pieces to the data book, whatever digital version of that for membership. Well, fantastic. We're a little before time, but still gives folks some breathing room before the next session. If there are no more questions, really appreciate the attendance and your questions, and we'll keep the world apprised of our progress. It's a really exciting project for us. So thanks so much for being here.
Thank you all.